Hello, my name is Hector Falero from Golden Gate National Recreation Area. I'm speaking to you today from unceded Ohlone Ramaytush land in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we acknowledge that the descendants of the Ohlone are still here today. Alana Smith and I are proud to introduce our speakers, who will be offering a look into the captivating history of African American and Japanese American soldiers during World War II. In partnership with Rosalind Tonai from the National Japanese American Historical Society and retired Ranger Rick Penn, it is our honor to spotlight the often undertold stories of those valiant people who risked their lives for a homeland that was itself prejudiced against them. As we share these stories, I hope that we can expand our perspectives as they relate to the story of World War II in order to understand it in its fullest. Please stay on after this live presentation for a question and answer session with retired Ranger Rick Penn and Rosalind Tonai from the National Japanese American Historical Society. So I'm really excited to present retired Ranger Rick Penn, who will be joining us to talk about the impact of African American soldiers and Japanese American soldiers during World War II. So excited to see you, Rick.
Hello, Rick. Thanks for joining us.
Hi. Hi. Well, I remember working at the Presidio in the 1990s, and I worked at the bookstore visitor center, which is now at the old Officers Club. And I had the great honor of actually meeting former members of these legendary military units. As a child, I remember seeing the movie Go for Broke on our black and white television set and hearing my dad talk about their legendary bravery during World War II. But it was many years later that I learned more of the historical record of the Buffalo Division, otherwise known as 92nd Division, while researching the original Buffalo Soldiers for the National Park Service. These stories are reflective of the struggles that communities of color have had to endure since the founding of the nation. The continuing failure of many white Americans to recognize and acknowledge the patriotism, loyalty, and devotion of their non-white counterparts is still rooted, I think, in the false ideology of white supremacy and the all too real workings of white privilege in the modern world. The following presentation, I think, will help provide some historical examples that reveal a record of civilian and military exclusion, incompetence, criminal neglect, and racial animus on the part of those in command during World War II. Let's begin with the story of the 92nd Division. It was formed against the wishes of the higher ranks of the armed forces, whose high command was dominated by officers and administrators who held a personal philosophy that blinded them to the abilities and rights of Black soldiers. The 92nd Division of World War II was the result of irresistible forces that resulted in its activation to fight in Italy. The 92nd was composed mostly of Black soldiers. They were actually known as the Buffalo Division because they wore a patch on their shoulder with the buffalo. Large numbers of them were illiterate, and most members were classified by the U.S. Army as Category 4 or 5, meaning they were the lowest acceptable soldiers to be drafted. All senior officers were white, mostly of Southern origin, because they knew how to handle Blacks. The political pressure from Black groups, a shortage of infantry soldiers, and the desire to begin the racial integration of the U.S. military forces all converged to create the conditions of the 92nd's rebirth during World War II. Originally, it was formed in World War I. The unit was now to take part in the attack of the underbelly of the Nazi Third Reich through the Italian campaign. For those who remember the strategy of the war, this military effort was not the main effort of the Allies. That was to come through the landings in Normandy on D-Day. The commander of the 92nd, a Major General Ned Allman, who, among others, considered the unit a trouble command, and professionally, he came to believe that his command was a profound disappointment. Certainly, it's likely that racism on his part In this case, the belief that the black soldier was inferior to white soldiers. Many officers were unhappy because they believed the unit was part of a social experiment, one that had failed badly. Allman blamed the failures of the 92nd on his black soldiers and characteristically did not believe that he was also responsible as the commander. The treatment and ultimately the performance of the 92nd was not up to par with other units in the military, and little was expected of them. Many instances of individual bravery have been documented in the 92nd, and some compare it with the famed Japanese-American 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the most highly decorated units of the entire war. The 92nd's performance was a disappointment to many military and senior civilian leaders, but not to the nation and certainly not to the expectations of the African American community. The same rigid mindset affected both African American and Japanese American units. As future Senator Daniel Inouye once said, "In all of us, in addition to fighting the enemy, we had a goal, which was an added incentive to succeed, and that was to redeem our name and to uphold our honor. Failure was almost impossible. We had to succeed." This attitude also was pervasive amongst the ranks of the 92nd Division, with many of its soldiers privately asking the question promoted through the WWII campaign. There was a newspaper in Pittsburgh called The Courier in the 1940s. It went all the way back to 1907 in its founding. It had long been used to voice the rights of African Americans. When World War II began in September 1st, 1939, the newspaper immediately made a connection between the United States treatment of African Americans and Nazi Germany's treatment of Jews. President Franklin D. Roosevelt wrote the newspaper's editor, Robert Vann, requesting him to tone down its rhetoric concerning racial discrimination. The newspaper complied for a while, but on January 31st, 1942, just weeks after the U.S. declared war on Japan and Germany after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Courier published a letter from 26-year-old James G. Thompson, a defense worker in Wichita, Kansas. Like most Black war workers at the time, Thompson could not work on the factory floor of the aircraft manufacturing company where he was employed. He was confined to working in the factory cafeteria. Thompson's letter, "Should I sacrifice to live half American?" It challenged the lofty rhetoric of U.S. war aims, contrasting them to the actual treatment of 1/10 of its population, the African Americans. At the end of his letter, Thompson reminded his readers that the for victory sign was being displayed prominently across the United States and amongst its allies, calling for victory over tyranny, slavery, and aggression as represented by the aims of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Thompson called for a double V victory sign, with the first V standing for victory over the enemies from without, and the second V for victories over enemies within, meaning those in the United States who would limit the freedoms of African Americans and others. Those politicians in America that ignored, overlooked, or who would not acknowledge the enduring loyalty and devoted citizenship of the Nisei and the African American soldiers have joined the infamous ranks of being part of one of the most shameful periods in American history. In retrospect, those brave and selfless fighters who had faith in the American dream stepped forward to defend the promise of the U.S. Constitution, even though their own dreams were being deferred. In the 1990s, Congress and the U.S. military began reviewing the cases of soldiers in World War II who had received the Distinguished Service Cross, but many have been denied the nation's highest Honor due to racism. As a result, in 2002, June 21st, 2002, Senator Inoue and 19 other Japanese American veterans of the 442nd Regiment were awarded the Medal of Honor by President Bill Clinton. The forgotten names of people like John Fox of the 92nd, Vernon Baker of the 92nd, Daniel Inoue and Sadao Munamori of the 442nd and 100th Battalion, these names should be front and center alongside the mentions of other heroes like Audie Murphy and Desmond Doss when it comes to citing acts of valor from the Second World War. In September 1944, the 442nd was reassigned to southern France, where they helped liberate a few cities from German control. They were reassigned again in 1945 and helped, along with the 92nd Infantry Division, an all-black unit, they helped to drive German forces out of northern Italy. It was during this campaign that these cited individuals acted so selflessly in performing their duty. Sadao Munamori posthumously received the Medal of Honor after he sacrificed his life to save those of his fellow soldiers at Cerveza, Italy. He was a private first class in the U.S. Army Company A, 100th Infantry Battalion, 442nd Combat Team, and it happened on April 5th in 1945. He fought with great gallantry and intrepidity near Cerveza, Italy, when his unit was pinned down by grazing fire from the enemy's strong mountain defense, and command of the squad devolved on him with the wounding of its regular leader. He made frontal one-man attacks through the direct fire and knocked out 2 machine guns with grenades, withdrawing under murderous fire and showers of grenades from other enemy emplacements. He had nearly reached a shell crater occupied by 2 of his men when an unexploded grenade bounced on his helmet and rolled toward his helpless comrades. He rose into the withering fire, dived for the missile, and smothered its blast with his own body. By his swift, supremely heroic action, PFC Munamori saved 2 of his men at the cost of his own life and did much to clear the path for his company's victorious advance. A similar story could be found in the story of John Fox of the 92nd Division, who was also posthumously awarded a medal for valor while fighting in Italy. As history recalls, it was before sunrise on the day after Christmas, the Germans attacked the villages just north and east of Gallicano. Although the primary German assault seemed to come from west of the river toward Gallicano, partisans were also battling enemy soldiers north of Somacolonia later in the morning. Within 2 hours, Somacolonia and the 2 American platoons there were surrounded. A 3rd platoon moved up to reinforce the embattled Somacolonia troops. Lieutenant John Fox, an artillery forward observer for the 366th, exemplified the impressive fighting spirit of the black soldiers. When enemy troops surrounded the lieutenant's position inside a house and were about to overrun him, he ordered artillery fire to be put directly on his own position, sacrificing his life. Fox's heroic action brought valuable time that helped save other troops, and he was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Like him, Lieutenant Vernon Baker was also with the 92nd Division, the only black regiment left in the division, while it gained 2 new regiments. At this time, the 473rd was made up of white anti-aircraft gunners who were turned into infantrymen. The division at this time also received a ferocious fighting unit composed of the Nisei soldiers, the famed 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The 370th formed the left flank with the 442nd on the right and the 473rd in reserve in the nearby Serchio Valley. In order to avoid the relentless barrage of the coastal guns, the 92nd Division, now jokingly referred to as the Rainbow Division, advanced toward Massa through the hills east of Highway 1. Even though fighter bombers flew sorties over Punta Bianca and British destroyers shelled the German positions, the coastal guns continued firing. In less than 2 hours, on April 5th, 1945, the 370th Lead Element, Company C, reached its initial objective. The company's artillery forward observer had to convince the artillery twice to give him fire support. The artillerymen could not believe that the riflemen had advanced so far. The Germans were surprised too. In fact, many were still eating breakfast when the Buffalo Soldiers arrived. The Company C radioed for reinforcements, but the regiment had problems of its own, with 2 company commanders already killed. No help arrived. The Germans within the castle fired on the lone company with machine guns and mortars. Before long, the company had suffered 60% casualties. The forward observer and a radio man were both hit, and the radio was destroyed, cutting off all contact with the outside. And that's when Lieutenant Vernon Baker, the company's only black officer, volunteered to harass the enemy so that the wounded could escape. Armed with hand grenades and on 2 occasions supported by Private James Thomas's automatic rifle fire, Baker personally destroyed 3 machine gun nests and an observation post. Baker, who had already received a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, would receive the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that day. Meanwhile, the 442nd fought the enemy ridge to ridge and systematically blew up German bunkers with bazookas. By April 6th, the Nisei had control of Mount Belvedere. Also in the fighting was Lieutenant Daniel Inouye. His unit took part in the fighting in France, where it successfully rescued the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Division, otherwise known as the Lost Battalion. The 442nd suffered devastating casualties in the assault. Some companies in Inouye's regiment had fewer than a dozen men when the engagement ended. Inouye's company was one of the most fortunate. It began the fight with approximately 150 men and had 42 men fit for duty following the battle. Inouye himself narrowly escaped death in France when a bullet struck him in the chest, but was stopped by the lucky silver dollars he carried in his breast pocket. In recognition of Inouye's courage and leadership during the battle, he was given a rare battlefield commission that made him a 2nd lieutenant. 2nd Lieutenant Inouye also received the Bronze Star for his heroism. So early in 1945, Inouye and the 442nd returned to Italy. On the morning of April 21st, 1945, Inouye realized he had lost his lucky silver dollars. That same day, he led his platoon on an assault on a German-held ridge near the village of San Terenzo. 3 German machine guns opened fire on Inouye and his men as they attacked. A bullet pierced Inouye's torso, but he continued to advance, shouting encouragement to his platoon and throwing grenades. He crawled to within 5 yards of the enemy emplacement and threw 2 more grenades, killing the enemy machine gunners. He then killed the crew of a 2nd machine gun with his submachine gun. Inouye proceeded to pull the pin on another grenade and prepared to lob it at a 3rd machine gun nest. He recounted what happened next. As I drew back my arm, all in a flash of light and dark, I saw him, that faceless German, like a strip of a motion picture film running through a projector that's gone berserk. One instant he was standing waist high in the bunker, and the next he was aiming a rifle grenade at my face from a range of 10 yards. And even as I cocked my arm to throw, he fired, and his rifle grenade smashed into my right elbow and exploded. I looked at my dangling arm and saw my grenade still clenched in a fist that suddenly didn't belong to me anymore. Inouye yelled to his men to keep back, pried the live grenade from his own mangled arm, and hurled it at the enemy soldier. Despite Inouye's grievous injuries, he continued advancing and firing his submachine gun with his uninjured left arm. Moments later, a bullet struck Inouye's leg, and he lost consciousness. When Inoue regained consciousness, he refused to be evacuated until he was sure his platoon had secured its objective. He continued to direct his men as they deployed in a defensive position in case of an enemy counterattack. Lieutenant Inoue and his men killed a total of 25 enemy soldiers and captured 8 others in the first successful attack. 9 hours after being wounded, Inoue finally arrived at a field hospital. Doctors doubted he would survive, but Inoue insisted that they attempt the operation. He had already been given so much morphine that doctors could not risk administering further anesthetics, and consequently, he underwent the surgery without sedation. He received a total of 17 blood transfusions. Most of this blood came from the Black soldiers of the 92nd Division. It was during this critical period that now Senator Inoue recalled that the doctors administering the blood transfusions would hold up the bottle so that he could read the name of the soldier that had donated the blood. There was also a practice during this time to confirm the race of the blood donor, because many white soldiers shunned the idea of receiving blood from another race. This practice was so odious because scientifically, there is no difference in the plasma that could save a soldier's life. Furthermore, it was oddly ironic that the doctor who pioneered the use of plasma as a lifesaver was an African-American doctor from San Francisco named Dr. Charles Drew. In retrospect, the co-joined fates of these units who fought separately and together exemplifies the struggles that soldiers of color endured simply to be seen as equal citizens and loyal and devoted Americans. At the outset of the war, they were unwanted. These men and women and their communities had to petition and protest to be included in the fight to defend their country against a common enemy. Even after their inclusion in the military's ranks, they had to further demand that they be given a real opportunity to actually fight the enemy. To further illuminate the unusual predicament of these soldiers of color, many of their brave and heroic actions were overlooked and ignored when it came to awards and significant medals of recognition. In the 1990s, Congress and the U.S. military began reviewing more cases of soldiers in World War II who had received the Distinguished Service Cross, but may have been denied the Medal of Honor due to racism. And as I mentioned before, in June 21st, 2000, Senator Inoue and 19 other Japanese American veterans of the 442nd were awarded the Medal of Honor. Other servicemen, including those of the 92nd Division, also received long overdue medals of honor and other significant recognition. Back then, President Harry Truman announced, "No loyal citizen of the United States should be denied the democratic right to exercise the responsibilities of his citizenship, regardless of his ancestry." The principle on which this country was founded and by which it always has been governed is that Americanism is a matter of the mind and the heart. Americanism is not and never was a matter of race or ancestry. President Truman said to the soldiers in his speech to the 442nd Battalion, "You fought not only the enemy, you fought prejudice, and you won. I agree that like the 54th Regiment of the Civil War, in which Black Americans fought for a country that had formerly enslaved them, the men of the 442nd showed so much courage in fighting adversity and decades of discrimination with hope and determination to carry out an important duty for America. These Japanese Americans and African Americans emerged from the shadows of slavery, the internment camps, the sufferings of their parents, to uphold the honor of their culture and people. In fighting for a country that had thwarted their efforts to thrive in so many ways, their pride and valor reflected the spirit of their families, who immigrated to America and strove to survive despite the hardest conditions. These soldiers paved the way, he's speaking of the 442nd, for the great change in the perception and status of Japanese Americans, as well as all Asian Americans, in the country that we are now proud to call home. This history of the Nisei and Buffalo Soldiers' lives, this history lives past those painful days of World War II and now manifests itself in the modern military's full integration of all Americans into our country's national defense. And a little footnote, the ongoing fight for the inclusion of the LGBTQ community into military ranks continues in the tradition of all communities who struggle for the recognition of their rights as American citizens.
And it is my pleasure to introduce Rosalind Chennai from the National Japanese American Historical Society.
Hi, Hector and Lana. Thank you for having me today.
They did what no other American soldier could during World War II. They wielded a weapon no other American soldier could use. It was a weapon learned in childhood. It was the Japanese language. These were the soldiers of the Military Intelligence Service, the MIS. At a time when their country did not trust them and they were stripped of their civil rights, these men were the first of thousands of Japanese American soldiers who defended the land of their birth.
This is our country. Japan is not our country. No matter how you look at it, you have to fight for your country. It doesn't matter who the enemy is.
Most of these soldiers were Nisei, or second-generation Japanese American. Some of these Nisei were Kibei, that is, they were born in America and sent to Japan to be educated. Ironically, while these soldiers were fighting an enemy that shared a common ancestry, their families were imprisoned in the United States by the same government the MIS soldiers had sworn to defend.
You take the oath to uphold the Constitution and fight for freedom and liberty, and to find your parents and siblings in camp. It was very difficult.
Japanese Americans in the Pacific War had to fight 3 wars. One was obviously the enemy and discrimination at home. But we in the MIS had to fight another war to prove ourselves in a battle, because we're always suspect of our loyalty.
The MIS soldiers interrogated prisoners, translated captured documents and diaries, intercepted communications, flushed out enemy soldiers and civilians from caves, and infiltrated enemy lines.
You got to know the culture and the background, because it's not just a matter of putting words together. It's a very complicated situation. You're not talking to friends, you're talking between 2 enemies trying to get information to help your own side.
They didn't have the luxury of treating the Japanese soldiers that they were fighting against as non-human creatures. They knew they were human. They knew they had feelings. They read their diaries and letters. Even after the Japanese soldiers had died, they could read the soldiers' letters and diaries. They cried over some of this stuff.
After the war, during the occupation of Japan, the MIS soldiers helped establish peace and spread democracy in the Pacific.
Without the Nisei, particularly the Kibei, who had had both the advantage and disadvantage of having spent years in Japan learning the language, but even more important, learning the philosophy of the Japanese in Japan. Without that specific understanding, emotion, and compassion, it would have been impossible for MacArthur and the American government to have instituted the kind of democracy that Japan enjoyed and was able to accept at that time. So from that occupation viewpoint, the role of the Nisei in establishment of Japan as a democracy was absolutely essential.
Their service helped win another battle, the fight for redress when the U.S. government formally apologized for imprisoning those of Japanese ancestry during World War II. The story of these veterans goes on long after their service. In June of 2000, more than a half-century after they served, these soldiers were honored with a Presidential Unit Citation. They had to fight for it because they never served together as a unit.
I just want to say that it is with the greatest feeling of humility and honor that I accept this prestigious Presidential Unit Citation for all of the men who served in military intelligence service during World War II.
There's no question that no matter what position any of us attain, whether it's me or anyone else in public office or in public service, we've only been able to attain those positions because of the past record of those in the military intelligence service, what our parents taught us, and to me, it's sort of a driving force.
A force that helped shape a people and a nation. The idea of a secret language school began in the spring of 1941, before war in the Pacific broke out. It would be housed at San Francisco's Presidio in an old aircraft hangar, Building 640.
We're milling around the Building 640. What are we doing here? What's this all about? A whole bunch of Niseis. What they're going to do to us? But on the 1st of November, we found out why we were assembled there. We were to learn Japanese language. I reported to the hangar, and I couldn't believe that this is school to begin with. And I couldn't find a door to go into the hangar. Oh, it was a dilapidated building. In fact, it was so cold, because of the cement floor. And we hung our duffel bag on the bunk. It was a 2-level bunk. Oh, entire floor, 2-level bunks. One side of the building became a commandant's office, faculty room, and our classrooms. And the other half became our living quarters. 60 of us were classified into A, B, and C. A is Kibe. B is Nisei, who spoke a little bit of Japanese and conduct a conversation. C, the kids that never spoke Japanese. And then we had a special section for Caucasian students. Your study is long, from 8 o'clock in the morning and to 4 o'clock and then 7 to 9. So that you're already tired, you sleep well, but the shower facility is limited, so that we had to take turns. And that was it, the very Spartan life.
December 7th, 1941 changed everything.
The curriculum became intense, and our attitude became different. And we focused more on combat and what you do in combat, the nature of war, the order of battle, significance, identification of the enemy, geography, and things Japanese.
This first class was the only one held in Building 640 in the Presidio of San Francisco. Soon after Pearl Harbor was bombed, Executive Order 9066 was issued. It ordered the confinement of people of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast, so the MIS language school moved to Minnesota. Building 640 in the Presidio of San Francisco was the original site of what was first known as the 4th Army Intelligence School and became the Military Intelligence Service Language School. It was the secret training ground during World War II for mostly Japanese-American soldiers in Japanese language skills. The National Japanese-American Historical Society, the National Park Service, and the Presidio Trust are partnering to create the MIS Historic Learning Center. They will present the little-known story of soldiers who fought the injustices of discrimination and defended their country loyally while their families were imprisoned on the West Coast. Educational programs will focus on the irony of their situation and ask the question, what would you have done? Permanent and temporary exhibits will present archival photographs, oral histories, historic documents, and other artifacts to interpret these times. This will be a place that talks about war in the context of peace, a place where differences can be resolved, a place to find that knowing another culture is more than acquiring language skills. At the MIS Historic Learning Center, we will be inspired by how those before us dealt with intolerance and extreme challenges and came away with a stronger sense of what it means to be an American.
Now, in the foreground of the Golden Gate Bridge at the Presidio of San Francisco, there's this building 640. It's the MIS Historic Learning Center. It stands as a proud symbol of patriotism and civil liberties. Now, here on the eve of war against Japan, in November of 1941, the school secretly opened, and they trained about 60 soldiers, 2 Caucasians, and 58 Japanese Americans enlisted soldiers in the U.S. Army. And like many pivotal experiences in U.S. history, the MIS story is one that is replete with ironies. Because 1 month before Pearl Harbor and that attack, the school began as a great experiment. They didn't know exactly what the Nisei soldiers were going to do, but they knew there was going to be a war with Japan. And among these soldiers, they were told under court-martial not to tell their families about the military training they're going to embark on. Nisei instructors in this makeshift classroom with barracks in the building as well. And the month before Pearl Harbor, everything was kind of fun. They would go to the burlesque shows in Chinatown and go to Japantown to eat at the restaurants. But after Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Things got very, very serious. And ironically also, from the Army, it became the Western Defense Command, the 4th Army headquarters. And it's only a few yards, 100 yards away, where the MIS classroom they were studying in. And pursuant to the President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, General John L. DeWitt and issued the fateful series of orders that would lead to the mass exclusion, roundup, and eventual incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans along the West Coast. And they would be eventually detained in temporary and then permanent concentration camps throughout the interior of the U.S. And even as their training intensified. These soldiers learned that their families would be having to go away. They would be losing their jobs, their homes, their farms, closing their businesses, and they would be eventually imprisoned behind barbed wire encampments. Although only one class existed, this class was going to go for 1 year, and it had to truncate to 6 months of intense study. They would be then graduated early in May of 1942 and deployed at places like Alaska and the South Pacific, where they would have to encounter their Japanese enemies in the front lines. And their mission began in Presidio. It had to close because of the Executive Order 9066 and find a new home. And a lot of governors did not want them. And the few governors that did, there was Governor Harold Stanton from Minnesota, who allowed the Japanese soldiers to resume their studies at first Camp Savage, and then eventually Fort Snelling in Minnesota. And there, the class grew to about 4,000, all told, probably throughout the World War II, and eventually also into the occupation of Japan as well. And that school became the MIS language school in Fort Snelling. Now, what was the impact of the MIS? They would have the most significant impact on the Pacific theater against Japan. Now, they're attached to every combat unit in the Pacific, and that's very unknown. What they were responsible for was translating secret documents, doing key intelligence from extracting them from prisoners of war, ultimately helped the American and Allied forces win the battles in the Pacific. They were America's secret weapon. Their ultimate knowledge of the language and the culture helped gain key tactical and strategic advantage over their opponents. And many of them affected the peaceful transition in the occupation of Japan. You know, they played as grassroots ambassadors, and they helped to lay the groundwork for Japan's democracy in the post-war era. Now, the soldiers of the MIS served as undercover agents in the Philippines. They fought behind enemy lines with the Merrill Marauders in the China-Burma-India campaign. They endured jungle warfare in New Guinea and the South Central Pacific. They landed in the Marines in the beaches of Iwo Jima, and they crawled into caves in Saipan, Okinawa, to persuade suicidal enemy forces to surrender. So unlike their other combatants in the war, the men of the MIS faced incredible danger on every side, from the enemy Japanese troops to their fellow American and Allied soldiers, who viewed them with suspicion and too easily mistook them for the enemy. The MIS gave the Allies a significant advantage during this war. In the field, the MIS gleaned vital operational knowledge through their skilled interrogation of prisoners and translation of captured diaries and maps and other documents. And they performed other tasks as well as volunteering for reconnaissance patrols and doing similar combat duties. And at least on one occasion, an MIS soldier helped win an engagement by creeping up behind enemy lines and impersonating a Japanese officer's commands to his troops. At the headquarters level, the MIS handled raw intelligence obtained from the field and communications intercepts, intelligence that provided the Allies with clear strategic advantage. Among the accomplishments was the translation of the Japanese Navy Z plan for the Pacific conquest, documenting the Japanese military order of battle, and supporting the code-breaking efforts that led to the downing of Admiral Yamamoto's plane. Now, after the war, the MIS soldiers played a vital role in the occupation of Japan, serving as vital links between General MacArthur and staff and the Japanese people. With the knowledge of the Japanese language and culture, the Nisei of the MIS helped to secure the peace and establish Japan's democratic institutions. They assisted in every aspect of Japan's reconstruction, and from the reform to education to civil and legal affairs. The MIS contributed to Japan's transition from a country ravaged by war to a great economic power and one of America's most trusted and important allies. Just as the Golden Gate Bridge symbolizes the historic linkage between East and West, the MIS's goodwill ambassadorship represents the true relationship between the US and Japan in the critical post-war years. The MIS also paved the way for integrating language in military planning and operations, a role consistent with the post-war policy of international engagement. Today, foreign language skills are integral to military intelligence collection and analysis. In fact, the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, the military's premier language training school located here in California, traces its origins directly to this modest classroom at Building 640 on the grounds of the Presidio of San Francisco. The MIS story and contribution to the war effort and rebuilding of Japan is really dedicated in this way to this development of the site. And it's very significant to the larger American story. And it went largely unnoticed until fairly recently. Their service was highly classified, and their existence in the MIS only became known to the general public with the passage of the Freedom of Information Act in 1971. So in recent years, thanks to congressional advocacy, the MIS veterans have accorded a measure of recognition by the US government, and scores of MIS veterans had blatantly received medal upgrades from Bronze Stars to Distinguished Service Medals. In 2000, as noted in the video, the Presidential Unit Citation, the military's highest decoration, was retroactively awarded to all members of the MIS who served in World War II. Comprehensive history and study of the MIS, that publication has come out on the Nisei linguist soldiers. Also in recent years, the honors of the gold medal has been awarded to the 100th, 442, and the MIS Nisei soldiers in recognition for their service to the United States. And in closing, and this really is a story of a multicultural exchange, of a story of civil liberties and justice, of issues that we address worldwide. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to having any questions and dialogue. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Rick and Rosalind. Two powerful and illuminating presentations. It's so important that we recognize the accomplishments of the Nisei soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers, both lesser known narratives. And it's important also that we consider how these histories connect to today. So what we're going to be doing now is we have a question and answer session. We really encourage all of you watching, put any questions that you have in the chat for Rick and or Rosalind. And, you know, did these presentations spark any wonderings, anything that's going through your mind? And we'd be happy to get some discussion going. And to start off, you know, I can, you know, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I would love to ask you, Rick, something that stood out to me in your presentation, one of many things, was this idea of how leadership impacted the Buffalo Soldiers, specifically the leadership of the white generals, how that impacted the success of the 92nd Infantry. Would you care to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think we all have to recognize that soldiers are human beings. You know, whether they be the commanders or the foot soldiers, the privates. And human beings are not perfect. We all have flaws. But when you're in a command structure where you are responsible for the welfare and the strategy that to keep your men safe to accomplish the mission, when you have deep flaws in your character, that not only can look bad on your record, but it can mean the lives of the people that are under your command. And two of the generals that were involved in the Italian campaign, and there were quite a few people who could have done a lot better in every situation. But two names come to mind. It's the General Dahlquist, who was with the 442nd, and a General Edward Ned Allman, who was with the 92nd in Italy. Many military reports have been written in retrospect looking at those campaigns and the failures or successes of those units. And more than a few veterans and some other military commanders who knew these officers cited their questionable leadership abilities, their lack of judgment, and sometimes the egotistical pursuit of glory that put their soldiers in harm's way when it was totally unnecessary to do so. And I would encourage those who are listening to do a Google search of General Edward Allman of the 92nd Division and a General, I believe it's John Dahlquist, Dahlquist, who was with the 442nd, because you'll find some reviews praising their performance, but I think you'll find a lot of other reviews from the actual men who they commanded who will have a quite contrary view of their abilities and leadership during World War II.
Excellent. Thank you, Rick. And we have a couple questions that are coming in now. Let's start from Shoshana. Let's see, how many of the MIS and Buffalo Soldiers are around and have been recognized?
I could quite answer the MIS question. Not too many, because I believe the men of the first class have all passed. They would have been over 100 years old. I think Tom Sakamoto was, we just missed him when we opened. He passed away 2 weeks just before our opening of the center, but he was real instrumental in the creation of its theme and its meaning. Many of the MIS guys, were sworn to secrecy. So a lot of their achievements and accomplishments have gone a lot of times unnoticed. They were also never a separate unit like the 442nd combat unit. They were detached to different, units. So they never served together. So actually it was Senator Daniel Akaka that made special legislation so they could get a presidential unit citation, as a unit. And that occurred, as Rick said, in 2000 by President Clinton. And around the same time that the Medal of Honors were awarded, and I believe there are 20, so altogether 21 Medal of Honors were awarded to Japanese Americans by President Clinton in the year 2000. I believe there's one of the highest awarded units in American military history for their size and length of service. So they have quite but not MIS.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I agree with Rosalind. One of the sad laments about being in the 21st century is that so many of our World War II veterans are just passing away day by day. And I have really no idea how many of them are still surviving from those units. I had spoken many years ago with Vernon Baker over the telephone. He was living up in Montana. And he just passed away last year in 2019. So he lived up until over just about a year ago. Yeah, I think it is a sort of a sad note to history that people can't live longer to share with us, or so that we can basically share with them our appreciation for what they did.
The MIS also, along with the 100th and 442nd, received the Congressional Gold Medal, and I think that was probably the most recent honor that they awarded. And the ceremony occurred obviously in Washington, D.C., but we did have regional ceremonies throughout the country, and some of them were presented some recognition even in the nursing homes where they were.
Great, thank you both. We have our next question from Diane. What books can we read to learn more about Buffalo Division?
There is one a book which I recommend, and actually I think it actually is called the Buffalo Division. I don't have the paper in front of me with the author's name. It has a bright blue buffalo in a circle on the cover. I found it by just perusing Amazon one day by accident. I didn't even know the book existed. There is another book I highly recommend. It's called An Eyewitness History of World War II by Carl J. Schneider and Dorothy Schneider. It doesn't specifically concentrate its information on the 92nd Division or the 442nd, though they are mentioned in the book itself. What's important about this is that these stories come from the actual soldiers and nurses and participants themselves. They were interviewed over time, and so it's their stories, and it's not a second or third hand report. And again, it's called An Eyewitness History of World War II. I will supply some more book titles to the producers of this event. So if you check back in the not too distant future, we'll have a list of books and websites that you can peruse and visit.
Great resources to check out for everybody. So let's see, next from Doc Video 93. Since Korea was a part of Japan after the 1910 annexation, and there were a large number of Korean laborers on Japanese-held islands, were Korean Americans a part of MIS?
That's a good question. I believe there are a few, but not as many as there should have been, because what happened right after the World War II is that they began to recruit the MIS Nisei linguists to work on the Korean conflict, Korean War, because of their Japanese language skills and the fact that many Koreans spoke Japanese. So a lot of folks that stayed over through the occupation went on to the Korean War as well. And I know from our MIS honor wall, there's a few Korean names up there, but not in the numbers that we would expect.
All right, now we have another audience question from Jim. How do modern school children react when they learn about these segregated Army units during World War II?
Well, in my capacity in the past, when I was telling this story on the Presidio within the National Park Service, and many of my classes were like fourth graders. And fourth graders, they love to talk about cannons and tanks and, all those little kind of the military action toys that they would see. And I would talk about the actual incidents of what it was like to be soldiers, especially during the time of segregation. They are quite fascinated to know this, but it's so foreign. It's such a distant concept for them that to think that people would be separated by their color in such a way that adults or grown-ups would do this. It's a little difficult concept for them to actually comprehend. But so sometimes I would do that same technique that their teacher did about kids with blue eyes, brown eyes, and green eyes, and I sort of postulate, okay, here's a hypothetical scenario, kids. What if I were to give all of you guys with the blue eyes the candy bars, but everyone with the green eyes and the brown eyes would have to do something else, and they would look at me and say, well, that wouldn't be fair. And so there has to be there are ways that kids will understand this, but not so much at a visceral level that maybe adults might comprehend later on after much more life experience.
Thanks, Rick. So from Pauline, we have, can you confirm that the Buffalo Soldier unit of World War II is the same unit that famously served in Yosemite? We can talk all about this, Rick.
There is in a strict sense, in a historical sense, there are 2 or 3 camps. Some people will say what the real Buffalo Soldiers were the actual Old West Cavalry, and anything past that is really not the Buffalo Soldiers. The people in the 92nd Division definitely felt like they were the spiritual descendants of the Buffalo Soldiers because in their unit, they did have a buffalo on their patch. But in 1944, the Army disbanded the cavalry. And there were no cavalry, no use of horses by the U.S. Army in World War II, at least not in Europe. So there are maybe certain demarcation lines you have to draw historically in separating who were the original Buffalo Soldiers and how long did they actually exist. Some historians will say that Buffalo Soldiers, because they were segregated, existed as long as there were segregated units within the military, which would take it into the Korean War. But definitely the glory years in historically speaking would have been in the Old West. It would have been definitely those days when they were among the first park rangers in Yosemite and Sequoia, and when horses were still the main mode of transportation.
All right, and then next we have from Kelsey. Would MIS students have interacted with other Presidio troops during mealtime when they'd go up the street to the bakers and cooks school? Was that a dining facility?
I believe so, but that's a good question. I haven't seen from the oral histories their interaction with many of the troops on site. So I imagine they didn't have that much time to eat because they talked about like having to jog there and then jog back in time for, classes. And so, and I think they were probably pretty much concentrated on their studies, especially when things got pretty rough. They pretty much stayed to themselves. I think in some respects, life outside of Presidio was probably pretty rough because they would comment about being, spat on or cursed at on trolley cars. And then one gentleman to kind of get the pass, they would don I am Chinese buttons so they wouldn't be harassed, by people, in public in San Francisco. So I think they had a lot in their minds, and I would think that they pretty much stuck to themselves during this critical time, and they weren't there very long either.
All right, I think that was our last question that we have from the audience. So we're going to go ahead and wrap our session up. I want to say a big thank you to Rosalind Tanai and Rick Penn. We really appreciate you sharing your incredible knowledge with us on these important topics. And then I also want to say thank you to the audience, everyone who's watching from home. Thank you for your participation. I hope you go on to share these stories and we're happy to keep up the discussion here at your national parks. And then also up next, we have an introduction to Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. That's coming up in the next hour. So thank you very much.